Hi, thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be with you all. And do ask questions at any time. And if you've got anything to ask later on, you can always find me on social media, and I tend to be quite bubbly and friendly. Shall I sail in, or do we have any more housekeeping?
Nope, that's the round of the housekeeping. I'll hand over to you. I look forward to it. So, good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If we could go on to the next slide, that would be great. So, my brief today is to talk about writing authentic characters, but also to introduce a little bit my path into writing, so that if there are other things you want to ask about, please do. I'm going to leave as much time as possible for the Q&A, because I am much more excited to hopefully answer your questions and hear from you and know what you're interested in, rather than just what I thought to waffle on about. So I have always wanted to be a writer. It's one of the first things I knew about myself and the world. There's one little teensy tiny problem, which is I'm extremely dyslexic, dyspraxic, ADHD, the works. And so not only could I not learn to write very well, I didn't even learn to read for a really long time. I didn't read remotely properly until I was 10. And so I was saying to everyone, oh, I want to grow up and be a writer. And everyone would say, well, in the nicest possible way, you have to be able to read books if you're going to be able to write them. But I was very determined, and thankfully I had a huge amount of help, and I eventually learned how to read, and as soon as I started, I did not stop, and then out started coming all the words. And the difficulty with that is, one of the things about being an author is we can all, hopefully, if we have the good luck to learn, or have the support to learn, if we're having difficulties like I did, we can all learn to write, and we all are quite good at telling stories just as human beings. It's a real thing that all human beings do it across history and societies, which is amazing. But learning how to be a writer is rather different. And because it was my big dream, I wanted to get there, and I didn't mind if it took me a while. And I kept saying to myself, if I were going to be a concert pianist, I wouldn't learn to play a piece of music through and only do the whole proper performance, all the bits of it together as I got on stage. No, I'd have to figure out how to do it, and I'd have to rehearse it a million times over. So I'm going to have to do a whole lot of stuff like that. I'm just going to have to learn how to write books before I worry about writing a good one. So that's just a generic piece of advice. If you want to be a writer, don't get hung up on writing something great to begin with. Get hung up on just practicing, so that you have all the skills to put the pieces together, so that you can write the book you want to write and hopefully get it published, if that's your dream, and not if it's not. But along the way, I had to earn a living, and also I thought to myself, it's one thing to learn how to write, I also have to have things to write about. Otherwise, it's all going to get boring really, really quickly. So I tried doing things that would tell me about the type of lives and experiences that I wanted to write about in my books. So I went into consulting in the theatre. I worked on a Broadway show, which was amazing. I worked in music festivals and all sorts in academia. And along the way, I did a PhD in creative writing. I was writing a historical novel, which I can tell you about if you want me to, and not if you don't. But I also was working on this project called The Bone Dragon. I showed it, a little bit of it, to my PhD supervisor. And I said, what do you think? And he said, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. Never mention this again. Stop working on it. And me being me, as with dyslexia and not learning how to read, I just said, oh, I'm going to make this good. And I did. And that got published. And that was my first book. And I am now about to have my fourth book out, but the current one that's out is this one, Sing If You Can't Dance, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. If I could have the next slide, please. So, two versions, and I'll come back to why that one is different in a minute. So, what is it all about? It is all about a girl called Ven, and we start on the best day of Ven's life. She and her dance group have got through the first rounds of auditions, and they're about to film the big audition round before they go on the live television show, so this big dance competition. Everything is amazing, and life is wonderful. There's one cloud in the sky, which is she's not been feeling very well for a while. And it's been kind of getting worse. And on the day, the big day, she feels terrible. But she said, oh, it's just nerves, it's fine, maybe I'm getting the flu. Never mind, just get on with it and we'll worry about it later. So they get on stage and it's the best thing. The music starts and they start to dance and then collapses. Now, this is pages 1 to 2, so I'm not really spoiling the book for you. Skip ahead 18 months, and life looks really, really different for Ven. She's been diagnosed with this disabling condition, and not only can she not dance, she's probably never going to dance again, and she's really having trouble with all of her mobility, so her walking is really bad, and she's needing to walk with a stick, and even that is very difficult, even getting around her school and her home. So her hopes and dreams of being a dancer are in absolute tatters, and everything seems terrible. But Ven is, of all things, not a quitter. So she says to herself, well, if I can't dance, I still love music. Maybe I can do something with singing. I've got a nice enough voice. One little hitch in terms of doing something immediate. Her high school choir they are so terrible. They are unspeakably bad. But Ven is the person who started her dance group and who was the leader of the dance group. And she said, well, if I can get that dance group in under 2 years onto this dance show and be doing really quite well until I collapse and ruin it all, maybe I can do something about the choir. The choir, on the other hand, not so happy to have somebody muscle in and take over. So it's a madcap romantic comedy with a music festival and friends and falling out and protagonist who just happens to be disabled. So what inspired this? Well, it was a book I never wanted to write. It came about entirely by accident, and people have been saying you should write something like this. And I said, no, don't want to. And the reason was I was going through a big shift with my health and with my mobility, and everything about it felt raw and miserable. And I just didn't want to go there. It just felt very private, and I didn't want to share it. And then one day I'm working on a different book, and I love this book. It's just wonderful. It's about all these happy things, and it's cheering me up no end. And somebody moves in front of my computer, puts a hand over my screen and says, stop that. You're not going to work on that anymore. And I look up, and there is a person who is not there, but in my imagination is there, and it is Ven. And she says, you are going to write my book now, and you're not going to do anything else, at least for a couple of hours, while I tell you what happens in my story, and you're going to write it down, and that's how life's going to be. So I said, don't want to, not happening, go away, figment of my imagination. I'll end up writing about myself, and I don't want to share this stuff. And then, and if you have read or do read the book, you'll understand this, says to me, do you think you're the only person in the world that this stuff has ever happened to? Really? You're not that special. Stop being such a drama queen. I am going to tell you my story. I am going to get your help to write my book. So shut up, open a new document, and we're going to write. And I thought I'd write 2 pages and it would all be terrible and the idea would fizzle out and that would be that. But I wrote for 2 hours and I had 3 chapters and they were great. And so then every single day we'd turn up in the morning and insist we spend the morning on her book before I could go and write the other book I was still writing. And that's how this came about. So I'm using that as an example for some of the things I'm going to talk about, which is how the idea for a book as a whole and the thing that inspires you to feel like you have to write this story is part of how you make the characters authentic. But I'm just going to do a slight little swivel into another subject, which is why does the book look weird here? Why do we have these two? Could I have next slide? And the reason is, I just thought this would be interesting terminology for you. This is called a proof or an advanced reader copy, an ARC. And the idea is that your publisher, if you have a sort of lead title book, a book that they're going to really promote and spend some money on, they print some rough copies when you're still kind of polishing it up and still editing a bit. But it's a very rough copy, which is why it's do not resell, because it's uncorrected proof. And they send that out to reviewers and book bloggers and things to get some word of mouth about the book going. So I love this, and I think it's so cute the way they made it look different, and they put a lovely quote on by Holly Vaughan, who is just an amazing author, and it's such an honour. But anyway, how did we end up with the final cover? It was quite an interesting journey. So authors usually don't get a lot of say. Sometimes they do. But in this case, my publisher Faber really came to me and talked about the cover, which was lovely. And we did some roughs, and they had some nice concepts, but I kept saying, these are all very art gallery, art student person obsessed with art. We need this to look not entirely unlike a music festival poster because, it's a music themed book. And I also said, one of the problems with their art things, which is art can often be beautiful rather than pretty, but so it sort of has almost ugly things that are lovely to look at because they're interesting, but disability is often associated with ugliness, not prettiness. And I really wanted to not have that on my cover. I just wanted to have a romantic sunset like other people in romantic comedies get, but disabled people, if they're in the book at all, don't tend to get that. And I said, okay, it's a total cliche, but it's not a cliche when a group of people who've never had that get that. So could we look at that? And then we had this amazing artist called Jeff Osterberg who does fantastic dramatic colours. So he brought that in to give it a little bit more oomph so it wasn't boring. But we also have the wheelchair and a walking stick in, and that was really important to me to capture the fact that some people have a range of mobility aids. It's not just a wheelchair, it's more complicated than that. So I hope you like the cover. I was really proud of it. So we had the concept, then we picked the artist, and we picked Jeff partly for this dramatic colours, and then he roughed some concepts up and we refined them, and that was that. Could I have the next slide? So all this brings me to some of the sort of focus, which is how do you get to those authentic characters? Well, I think it is from having a concept that lets you do it. But as hopefully I've shown in terms of this book, you don't have to write about your own life. You can, but that's autobiography, not fiction. But what you can do is you should write perhaps in fiction from life. So the difference is not that I told my story of my issues with my mobility, but then came along and said, I have picked you to write this because you're not the only person in the world who it's happened to. The other thing she said was, but you know what it feels like. You understand the issue, so you can write my story when somebody else couldn't. Obviously, that's all my imagination finding a way to feel like I can write about this, but it was a mechanism to let me write from life, inspired by, but not about myself, which was really important. And I think that every book needs a spark, like the soul of the book, and it's a little piece of your soul, which I know is a bit woo, but writing is like that sometimes. There needs to be that bit of magic. And I think it is something deeply important to you, often something painful, but it could be something joyful, just something hugely deep in you that you put in the book. And it's not that it goes into the book in exactly the same form as it's in your life, but you've used that as your jumping off point to make that book come alive. And that leads to the book or story only you can write, which I'm going to come back to that, but I'm just sort of bookmarking things. So if we could go on to the next slide in the meantime. I'm just going to have a quick drink. So this is a little exercise that you can do now, but you can also do it anytime you like. And I find it's a really good way to train your mind in the types of things that are useful to you as an author. So think about your journey to school or wherever you are, even if you're downstairs in your pajamas watching on the screen. What was that journey like? What happened? But instead of thinking about all the things that happened, what do you think you might have noticed? Something you saw, something you heard, something you smelt, something you felt, that you think other people might have been oblivious to? Then the next step is, how could I put that into words that aren't entirely like other people's words? How can I get that to be as close to the specificity of the way I perceive the world as possible? Now that's obviously very micro level, but if you blow that up to the macro level, that's how you get to the concept of an idea that only you can write, which leads into characters who are authentic and interesting. Could I go to the next slide, please? So in doing this, there are a couple of important things, which is what you leave out is as important as what you put in. So if you're talking about walking through the park, you kind of don't need to say that the leaves on the tree are green, if they are, because mostly the leaves on the trees are green. If they're blue, we really want to know that. Or if they're red, it's autumn. That's interesting. So Stephen King gave that as an example to talk about how do you tell the reader not what they know or they can fill in or they can work out for themselves, but what they would never imagine unless you put it in front of them. And then we're getting somewhere really exciting. Could I have the next slide, please? So, first, concepts. What can you bring to a book? that will make it interesting, will get you to those authentic characters. So make some lists, perhaps. What experiences have you had? You know, do you have a hobby? Do you have an interest? Is there something you know about? Do you live on a farm or in a lighthouse? Or do you have a million cousins like I did, Italian family? Whatever it is, those things start building a picture of all the interesting things that only you can bring to a book. And observation and reflection. So like we talked about in the noticing exercise, dwelling on that, what are the patterns of things that I notice that other people might not? What am I tuning into that really tells me how I see the world in ways that are unique and interesting? Could I go on to the next slide? So from that, we have interesting ideas, which leads to interesting people. But who those people are, it just depends. I never write people into my books. I write when I don't like somebody, they do something really bad. I sometimes write the bad thing they do into a book, because if they didn't want to be in a book as a villain, they shouldn't be nasty to people. But I don't write people into books otherwise. People are too big and complicated to fit in a book. But at the same time, you can use what you know of the world to help make your characters feel authentic. And I think the way characters feel authentic is if they're real people. If, like Ven, when she appeared to me, I knew she was a figment of imagination, but she talked to me and said things I wasn't expecting. She was so real in my head that I didn't write me into the book, because Fen isn't like me, and we have different thoughts, we have different beliefs, we have different ways of going about things. And I think one of the ways you learn how to do that is the equivalent of method acting. So in method acting, instead of saying, I'm an actor and I'm playing Henry V, you say, I am Henry V, I am the king. What is it like to be the king? And you sort of go in that sort of mode, and you try and actually embody and inhabit the character you're playing. It's the same thing with books. If you were this character, what would life look like? What would that character notice on a journey to school that you wouldn't notice? And all of those things. Could I go ahead, please? So, a difficult thing is if you're writing a character who isn't like you, and you know, we all write characters who aren't like us, because otherwise our books would be full of carbon copies of ourselves, which would be deeply, deeply boring, would not reflect the world, and would be horrible. It can be really difficult to pick a main character who is very, very different from you. If you do that, that's absolutely fine, but you have to really research it deeply. And my big tip on that is don't just read research about the type of people that you think your character belongs to. Read accounts, read memoirs, autobiographies, watch podcasts, listen to TikToks by people who you think are like the protagonist. See what they actually have to say, not what other people have said about them. So that is my big tip for research. Could we go one slide on, please? So all this connects together. So we talked about the noticing thing, which is more if you were writing settings and descriptions, but as I've said, it kind of billows out to inform the whole of the book, and I think it does that largely through voice. So this is a lovely quote. Voice is not only a unique way of putting words together, but a unique sensibility, a distinctive way of looking at the world, an outlook that enriches an author's whole body of work. And that's very much how I see it. My way of perceiving the world, my experiences, all the people I know, all the things I've felt and thought myself, they feed into my ability to have interesting ideas nobody else could have, which then inform who is the best character through whom to tell that story. And then I make that character as into a whole real person who can tell me off when I get things wrong in the writing. And that's how I get an authentic character. Could I go one slide on, please? So, what is the story and you can write? Could we go one slide on as well? This is the big question. And I got that piece of advice from a magazine called Dyslexia. And it's all about women's writing, women writers. And I was struggling because my PhD supervisor had just told me my book idea that I was so in love with was terrible and should never see the light of day. And I thought she was wrong. Even though it wasn't what I was working on for my PhD, I really thought it was great. And then I read this thing in dyslexia that said, your debut novel should be the story only you can write. And I sat there thinking, well, that's true of my PhD book, but actually, I don't think I'm a good enough writer yet to do that justice. I'll finish the novel and I get my PhD, but it's not going to be publishable. This other book, I'm ready to write this, and nobody else would ever have thought of this idea. And that's the idea that became this. So in that, one of my guidelines, and I think hopefully it will have come through from the noticing exercises, don't try to be original or unique, whatever that means, just be you. You are already original and unique. You don't have to try. If you can tap into what is already special about the way you see the world, your experiences, everything you have to bring to bear, your book will be more interesting. So if you go one slide on, we come back, I think, to what is the story only you can write. That is how you get a book that will matter to you and that will help you through the endless process of editing, which is quite a trial after you had it. But I think that's the way in. And I don't know if you agree with me. You can tell me in the comments if you don't, and we can chat about it. But I do think if you're interested in being published ever, that concept of what is the thing that I have something special to bring to this, not because I've made that happen, but because I've tapped into who I am and what matters to me, that will take you forward in a way that will be authentic and that will spill through in your characters. And I think that was what I was going to say to begin with, because I wanted to leave time for the questions.
Great. Thank you. It was really interesting, and it's great to have a kind of an insight to your books as well. So hopefully we can get as many questions answered now as we can. So let's go and let's start. Let me just move around. We've had loads in, and we'll start with this one that's at the top of the list. It's come from Burnside College, and they've asked, what was your favourite book when you were at school?
That's always such a hard question. Never ask an author that, because they will tell you about 7 million books. One of my many favourite books is, probably loads of people will know this, Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I also really love Charmed Life. I love almost all of her books to pieces, and the ones I don't love completely I still like. She's just so inventive, and she's great at being surprising. So she sets up Howl's Moving Castle with this line about three sisters going off to seek their fortune. And it sounds like a very traditional fairy tale. And then she spends a whole book turning all the cliches and stereotypes on their head and proving that, it's what you do with yourself that really matters. And I love the fact too that her characters are really imperfect. They're not always likable, but you love them because of their flaws, and that's what makes them human, authentic. So I try to capture those types of things in my writing, and also her humour. The books are so funny and wacky and wild and inventive, and if you don't know them, totally recommend them.
Thank you. Our next question then comes from a Durham Sixth Form Centre, and they've asked, do you think books should be overall more plot-driven or more character-driven?
This is such a great question. And my answer would be the sort of slightly sneaky one, but it is the truth, which is, I think in the best books, the character drives the plot and the plot drives the character, and the two interact. So it's kind of the same thing. When I'm teaching at university, so I teach the MA in writing for young people, and I supervise PhD students, Barnsley University, which has amazing creative writing faculty. Anyway, when I'm teaching them, one of the things that is very difficult to learn, but is very important, is what we're doing is story. And story has plot and character that goes into it, but when it works really well, everything is part of the same fabric. So the things that happen to the character make them change, but who the character is makes them react to those plot challenges in specific ways. So I would say the best books understand that the thing is story, not plot or character. I think you have to have an amazing character so that your plot is interesting, because when something happens, you don't know what the character's going to do, and you're surprised, and they have stuff to learn. And every time your character faces an obstacle, ideally, you either see them grow or learn, or you see them fail sometimes. But that gives them the motivation to, when they have another challenge, go, I'm not going to fail this time. And as a reader, you're like, yes, yes, this time we will succeed. So yes, so I would say ideally it should be both, and those two things make up story. So yes, layers of plot and character interlocked, please, if we can.
Great. I'm going to keep carrying on and throwing as many as we can at you. So our next question then comes from NCC London, and they've asked, how do you avoid getting bored with the concepts that you've created? Obviously, because books can take years to write, or maintain the conviction that that what you are doing is good and worthwhile. And I think that's quite a nice question, because you kind of touched that on a little bit in your presentation.
Yes, it's a fantastic question. And it's one of the things I talk to my students again a lot about, what, and it does come back to what is the book only you can write? Because if you know that it's the book only you can write, and you're tapping into that deep thing and you're putting that little bit of your soul in it, whatever that is, remember, it doesn't have to be about you, but it's something that matters to you, that you're filtering through the book into someone else's story, who is that character who hopefully feels like a whole round, real person who can come and interrupt you when you're working and demand you write a different book. If you have all of those things, it is much easier to stay, because it sort of feels like there's this character who's another person who is then cheering you on and saying, I want my story told. And it doesn't feel like you're just taking it all out of you. You have this sort of duty to this world. And if that concept is something you're really passionate about and you think, this isn't out there, it really should be out there, and I can do that, that really helps. Because yes, the rounds of editing, I mean, if it's useful to touch on this, as an author, I usually do about 10 rounds of editing on a book, and that's standard usually before it goes to my agent, who may then do up to 6 rounds with me, depending on what's going on. Again, that's pretty standard. Then it goes, and if it gets bought by a publishing editor, there are a minimum of true big rounds of structural edits, minimum. It's often like 4 or 5, and then line edits where you're sort of sorting out the sentences is at least 2, if not 4 or 5, and then you copy edit it, and then you proofread it, and that's at least twice each, and then you do final checks. So yeah, you really have to sustain your motivation. So if you pick something that is authentic to you, that has that spark, I don't think you will lose track of that. You might get tired, which is a different thing, but because it matters already, that gives you the push.
Really interesting. I had no idea that there was that much. I know, you know that people go through redrafts. When you're in school, when you're in university, you write essays and you redraft the essays, especially if you have learning difficulties like us. Many drafts for the extra to get all your mistakes. But that sounds like a colossal amount of editing and so many different people's eyes and points of views on it. Crazy, really.
It's a long journey. That's one of the first things we tell our students, so they don't go in with these weird expectations. And we say, we are asking for a lot of editing, but there is so much more than you think. And, that's normal. I'm a published author, and that is what I do on every book, because only feedback will help you write the best book you can write. And it's just a really, 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 really long journey, but it's totally worth it if it's your passion.
Definitely. And we've had a question come in. I don't believe it's come in. Let me just check with any name. I think it might be an anonymous question. If we just have a second, obviously I want to get it asked. Yeah, and it's anonymous. We don't have a name for this, but the person has asked, how do you go about getting a book published?
So there are various routes. Nowadays, it's really hard, except in quite sort of niche areas of publishing, to not have an agent. So I would say the first thing is to try and get an agent. So what you do is you go on the agent website, and there's this thing called the Writers and Artists Yearbook, and they have all the agents in there, and it describes what they're looking for. And you have to sort of look on their website from that and figure out, does this agent want what I want? Look at the people they represent. Are those books at all like mine? And then if there's any terminology you're not sure about, make sure you go and really look it up and understand what it is and read a whole bunch of books in that area so you get what it means in practice. And then you follow their submission guidelines, which is nowadays it's all by email. You don't post things. You send in whatever they ask for. It's usually about 30 pages, 3 chapters, and then a synopsis, which is a plot summary of the whole plot of the book, and a short 1-page cover letter that's about you, why you wrote it, that type of thing. But there are also things like Pitch Wars, which is on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it now. There's a hashtag which is called Pitch Wars, and there are whole variations of those where you can write a tweet-length pitch for your book on a day when agents will go and look at those, and if they like it, they will request stuff from you so you can get a sense of, does the agent like me? Am I fitting their thing? So that's what happens, and then your agent does all the pitching to publishers and you don't have to do any of that. And then you just see what happens. And what I would say is, it takes most people years to get an agent, let alone a publisher, and that's just totally normal. So if you want to do it, that's great, but expect it to take a very long time. And then you won't go in going, oh, it's going to happen the first time and you're disappointed. You know, expect it to take 4 years. And then if it takes 3, happy days. But it's better to go in expecting less so that you're really happy when something good happens. And that's just what the industry is. So, you know, be prepared and go to some talks online, offline. There are free things, there are recordings, there are lots of lovely blog posts, and find out how the industry works. Because if you know a little bit about it, when things seem to take forever or nobody wants your work, you won't get the wrong end of the stick. You know, most people get zillions of rejections before they get anywhere. So learn about what to expect, and then that will hopefully be a happier process and you can be a little bit more relaxed about it taking time. But in the meantime, get a job that is not writing so you have something to keep you going financially, but also for your ego, because it is really ego denting. But it's lovely when you get there.
Yeah, definitely some good, just general life advice. You know, if you go, this is what I really want, but I'm expecting this. When things go great, you get really happy and you get less disappointed when things don't go so great. So we've had some more questions come in live, so I'll ask one of these next. So it's anonymous, and we've had several. We'll go with this one. In what way does reading other books assist in writing one?
Fantastic question. It helps in so many ways. Let me count the ways. It improves just your prose writing, your ability to understand the range of ways you can say the same thing, you know, and it's not about copying other people, it's about learning what the options are so you can decide what to do. So one of my all-time favorite writers is Barbara Kingsolver, and she does books in different narrative perspectives. So 1 minute it'll be first person, the next it'll be second person, you do this, or the next it'll be third person, she, he, it, they, whatever, did this. And her ability to transform what you learn about the characters just through that is phenomenal. And there's this one bit in a book called Animal Dreams where one character, they've been in a relationship and they split up, and it says something like, and I'm paraphrasing, I could have reached out and touched his hand then, but I didn't. I thought, this is just amazing. I had never thought about the fact that quite often what matters isn't always what we do, it's what we don't do as well. And I carried that through the whole rest of my writing life. What are the things that are happening in a character that through, especially first person, we get access to, that actually tell us more than the action, which is nothing happened, but something could have happened. And that was just so beautiful. But then there's also things like, I once thankfully didn't teach a student, but went to a talk where I was trying to talk to the new students on the MA programme, not mine. And I said to one of them, oh, what are you reading? And the student turned around and said, I do not read, it sullies the pristine purity of my genius. And I really didn't have very much to say to that. So I asked what was the last book the person had read, which had been about 5 years ago. And then I made my excuses because there's really not much you can say to that. Reading will never sully the pristine purity of your genius, no matter how genius your genius is. Read as much as you can. So the other thing is, if you read a book that is sort of touching on the stuff that you think you might write, and you find somebody's doing something that you were considering doing, that's not a bad thing, because you know that what you were planning is unoriginal. And you might think, how do I put a spin on it? And that's always really good, because there's no point writing books that are already out there. I mean, that's kind of my whole shtick about the book you can write. Part of that is what is already there and how can I add, what is special? And it will usually be the case that the ideas that are out there are a bit more obvious, and by having to work at a new idea or making your own current idea a bit more special, you get something really fantastic, and then that's much more publishable as well. So no downside. Read as many different things as you can, read across genre, read things you think you won't like, not all the time, but occasionally challenge yourself, read scripts, read graphic novels, whatever it is. If it's story, it will teach you things if you let it.
I love that you mentioned script, because my next question comes from the sixth form Bolton, and they've asked several questions about script writing, and I really like this one. Do you have any advice for writing dialogue? So you can talk about that within books and perhaps within screenplays as well. I know there might be a little bit some difference there, but advice on writing that dialogue, and I imagine making it realistic.
Yes. So one thing that is really helpful, but is not how you write dialogue, but it helps get your brain in gear, is transcribe a conversation. Get people's permission to record something and write it out. And what you will find is there is no grammar, there is no structure. People start one sentence and continue with another. There are bits missing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you get a sense of the rhythm of speech, and you do not want to write dialogue like that, for the record. It is incredibly boring if books were like that. It would not work. You want a distilled version of that, but sometimes you want just a little bit of the sense of that to have the humanity in the person. So learn what it's like, but then use that lesson very, very sparingly. I think the best piece of advice on dialogue I can give for scripts and for novels as well is don't use dialogue to tell the reader information if you can possibly avoid it, because that is you putting words in the character's mouth. That is not authentic. What information do they want to give another character? Think about what the character wants to say. How are they feeling? If you can make your dialogue driven by emotion, that's really powerful. So if you need to get some information across, somebody dashes into the room, tells their best friend, I've got to tell you what happened, I've got to tell you what happened. We are in there and we don't care that we're being told a lot of stuff. But if a character just comes in and says, I want to explain to you the history of, we're saying, like, do we have to? So there's this screenwriting book called Save the Cat. Don't treat it as a Bible. It's amazing, but the best way to see all books about creative writing as tools, not rules. All of these things are flexible. Use them when they're useful, ignore them when they're not. But Blake Snyder has this idea of, if you have to dump in a lot of information, like the history of this, how to work a vault in a bank, you get a character to tell it to the Pope while the Pope is in the swimming pool. Because instantly, this is hilarious. And obviously, it's not the Pope and it's not the swimming pool, but he calls it the Pope in the swimming pool. How can you make the transfer of information interesting? Can you make it funny? Can you make it sad? How can you do this? So always think, what is the emotion? Why does the character want or need to say this? And if you can avoid putting information in dialogue and have it in other ways, like visually. So instead of having a character say, oh, by the way, my dog just died, but instead you go into the house and on the side table there's a photo of the dog and there's the collar and there's a little candle and stuff. We've got that in the visual storytelling, and it's actually more powerful because the reader has to put together the pieces rather than being handed them. And that can be a very powerful way of engaging the reader's sympathy in a way that the simple telling doesn't do as strongly. So those are my tips.
I love that. And hopefully we'll get the name of that book shared so it's there in case anyone missed it. We have time just for a couple more questions and we're almost at the end of our time, sadly, and we've got loads to go. I'm going to ask this one that's come in from Hannah. She says, I'm also ADHD, etc. And I really struggle with motivation and sticking to my guns as I have 1,000,001 ideas. Definitely get that. Do you have any advice?
Oh, that's a really hard one. The thing that helps me when my brain is doing that and I need to settle is I have this thing I say to myself, if not now, when? If I don't get this thing written, I won't have a book and then I won't get published. And if I don't do it now, when am I actually going to do it? And it really helps me just sit down because it's like, I want to get my next book published. So I have to sit down right now and do this chapter because if I put it off, it won't ever happen. It does mean you have to then prioritize, but just I think that's a lot about just being honest with yourself about what matters most to you. And it is okay to, up to a reasonable point about paying the bills, getting through exams enough that things are good, to sort of follow your heart in that, especially if it's something creative. Follow the thing that's calling to you because that will really help. But yeah, at the end of the day, if you want to reach your goals, you have to do the legwork. So just reminding yourself and saying, if I'm not going to do it now, when exactly am I going to do it? And if necessary, timetable that in. But it's that type of thing. Don't put it off if it matters to you.
Yeah, definitely. I had a friend who did small rewards. So every 500 words, she'd watch a YouTube video or something to help her try and stay on track and not drift. But all sorts of different techniques and things that you just have to try and find out what works for you. Our next question, then, I think we have time for 2 more maybe, comes from the Greycoat Hospital School. And they've asked, do you have to have an English degree to be a writer?
Absolutely not. So I don't have an English degree at all. My first degree was social and political sciences. I majored in psychology. I did this really special thing, so I qualify as a research psychologist. I knew that I could learn how to write through consulting and editorial work, which I was doing alongside my studies. But if I had nothing to write about, it wouldn't matter if I knew how to write. So I didn't do an English degree. I then taught English literature for a while when I was doing my PhD, but my master's degree was in educational psychology and technology. And then I did a PhD in creative writing and I was teaching literature. So I went to a lot of the undergraduate lectures to kind of pick up some stuff so I knew how to teach them. But it really doesn't matter about an English degree at all. You don't have to have a degree full stop. It can be really helpful, but it actually matters much more that you're writing and that you're reading, that you're practicing, and you will at some point need probably to have a critique group or a workshop group or go on a course or get a freelance editor because what we can learn from other people is always more than we can learn from ourselves as authors. I'd never get anywhere with my books to the point where I want them without my editors and my agent and everything and my career partners. But no, you don't need an English degree. You do not need a degree. It is the doing of, and find the path on that works for you. There are lots and lots of different ways forward. But yeah, it really, really doesn't matter at all, and nobody in publishing cares.
I love that you mentioned what you studied, because we actually had someone saying, is it worth looking at psychology, sociology? So within that, definitely, I love that you answered that. So final question then, as we end today. We've had this come in a couple of different times, worded a different way. So I thought it would be a nice one to finish off because quite a few people asked it. And it's around creating believable relationships between your characters. How do you go about doing that? Do you have any advice or key tips to think about when doing so?
Yes, it's such a challenge, but it's really exciting. I think if you already have authentic characters, it makes it easier. I guess the main thing is relationships are hard. Even when you get on really well with people, there will be differences. So if you want to have a believable relationship on the page, make sure the reader sees that relationship being challenged. So put things in the character's way that will kind of make them either fight or come together. See what they do, because if the relationship matters to them, they will figure out a way forward. And if the relationship actually matters less than they're kind of pretending it does, you'll see them drift apart, and that can be interesting too. So in Sing, If You Can't Dance, there's a lot of relationship changes and things. So I had to think very carefully about, people don't trust each other right away, certainly not with really important things. What can I have happen to my characters, the plot, that it's believable that they can learn from that to change enough to become friends later on? So that's plot and character together again. And so Ven's best friend Maddie is also in the dance group with her. So obviously their relationship is very much altered by Ven's disability because she can't dance anymore. And she is so upset she can't face having anything to do with it. So they're not spending time together anymore. So challenge those relationships, and the challenge itself will create believable, interesting things that will let you learn about the relationships through active storytelling rather than just, and now as a writer, I'm going to tell you that they're best friends. I want to see that. Do they surmount the problems or not? If they do, that tells you a lot about what matters to these people.
Lovely. I think that was a great one to finish on. We have run out of time. Sorry we didn't get around to every question, but we had so many. Hopefully you've answered at least a little something, whether during the presentation or the Q&A that was got that. Before we close today's session, do you have any final kind of thoughts or feelings that you'd like to share with those watching today, Alexa?
Well, I just wanted to say to everyone, thank you so much for coming along and giving up some of your time. I really hope this has been interesting to you, and thank you for your amazing questions, which are absolutely fantastic. Fantastic questions. If there's anything you want to know, you can either send some questions to Charlie and I'll try and sort of answer some of those and either put them on social media or find a way of getting some answers back to people. If there are 200, I probably can't manage, but I could do a couple more. And do find me on social media. I love talking about books, so you're very welcome to, your teacher gets to ask me something or you ask me something. It's better if it's in public for safeguarding reasons. Obviously, I'm a very nice person, but always be wary of people on the internet you don't know for a fact that I'm lovely. I hope I am. I'm a bit weird, but anyway. Mostly just whatever your passion is, it's okay if it takes a while. You know, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but I knew it was going to take me a while, partly because of my dyslexia, but just because it does. It is okay if you spend a while achieving your dreams. Work steadily towards them. Keep in mind that if not now, when? If not now, it's not about getting it now. It's about being on the path. So as long as you're going towards it, that's really what matters. Read everything you can, find out about things, have interesting experiences. Like I had this opportunity to go and work on Broadway, obviously not on stage, I'm not an actory person, but if you get those experiences, those will feed your writing. So just enjoy that and don't worry about being original. Don't worry about being special. You are special. You are original. We are all individuals. Sort of get hold of what that is. And if you want to be a writer, put it in the book. If you want to be a screenwriter, put it in the script. Whatever it is, take that thing, figure out what it is, and offer it. And people will be interested in that. And it is not more complicated than that. It's hard to do, but at the end of the day, it is that simple. But thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you on. Thank you.